explain parables, which he does not usually do. But I don't know why Jesus would choose these parables to explain. They seem fairly straightforward. There are other parables that are far more in need of an explanation from Jesus. But let's work with the parable that we're given in the lectionary for today. These parables of seed sowing, good soil sorting, you don't really need any explanation, right? Not from Jesus, not from generations of preachers that have come after Jesus. Or maybe you're saying, wait, this doesn't really sound like good Lutheran theology to me. Where is grace in all of this? What happened? Where is grace in the bundling up of weeds and throwing them in the furnace? This does not sound like Lutheran theology to me. We're using the Revised Common Lectionary, and the idea of a common lectionary is that all Christians are hearing the same text on the same Sunday across the world. Again, this is the ideal. Plenty of churches go off and do their own thing, and they don't stick to the Revised Common Lectionary. But today's parable, I'm here to tell you, will fit in much more neatly with the theology of some other denominations. You may have friends in those denominations who are happy to tell you about who's headed to hell and who's not. Then Luther is his idea of grace not so much in this parable, or perhaps it is. The vision of the end time, when God returns to judge the living and the dead, this vision at the end. And again, like I said during the youth sermon, this is not a vision of the end of our individual lives, but a vision of the end of time, where end gives way to the next time of God. And this would be a vision that energized the Apostle Paul. Last week I talked about Paul and how many generations of Christians have treasured his letters, but he had a very different vision. He was not writing in letters in hopes of being the theologian of a new church. He was not writing letters thinking that we would be reading them thousands of years later. He thought that God would be returning very soon, that the judgment of the living and the dead was underway. He saw Jesus who was dead. He knew Jesus had been dead. Jesus appears to him in the flesh. That's one of the signs that the judgment in the end time is underway. The dead return to be living again. When we get to Good Friday, when we have the text about when Jesus dies and the dead righteous folks rise up and roam around Jerusalem, that's what that part is doing in there. It is a time of judgment signified by the dead returning to life. Paul sees a dead man return to life. He assumes that God will be returning momentarily, literally, momentarily, to judge the living and the dead. He is not too worried about the Jews and salvation. He figures the Jews are people of the covenant. They have known for some time, generation after generation, what they needed to do for God to find them worthy. Paul is worried about the Gentiles who have not had the benefit of generations of teaching and prophets and the law. So that's why he's writing letters. He's hoping to rescue the Gentiles who will be judged as well and who need a head start. So when we interpret parables in traditional ways, we might be thinking in terms of a human lifespan, the way that Paul is, not in a cosmic lifespan, not in God's timeline, but our timeline. We might think about the spiritual practices that are likely to save us from the fire, from the final judgment. I've preached these sermons, so I know the pull of this interpretation. How easy it would be for me to bring my sermon to a close by urging you to seek out spiritual disciplines that work and to jettison the habits that are keeping us from being our best spiritual selves, to choose spiritual practices that will help us to be the wheat that we want to be, not the weeds that we're afraid that we are. But in today's parable, we see Jesus reminding us that it's not always obvious which seeds are which at the time of sprouting. God the gardener takes a wait-and-see attitude. The interpretation of the parable at the end reminds us that God takes a longer view, the kind of view that waits to see what the garden produces. The Apostle Paul has always been important to Christians, even in his lifetime. But what about apostles that had their work undermined by those workers who are so ready to yank out weeds? This week, my thoughts have returned to Mary Magdalene. And you may be saying, why? It is not Easter. Why are your thoughts going to Mary Magdalene? That is usually when we hear about her. at Easter, if at all. But her feast day is this week. Her feast day is Wednesday, July 22nd. And hers is one of the first feast days devoted to someone other than the 12 male disciples. Modern Christians have a plethora of feast days to celebrate. Ancient Christians would have had far fewer, one for each disciple, a few for the earliest apostles, like Mary Magdalene and Paul, and a few that celebrated events in the Gospels, like the Annunciation, 9 months before Christmas when the angel Gabriel visits Mary, the mother of Jesus. The fact that Mary Magdalene was one of the first of the non-disciples to get a feast day should tell us about her importance. But for centuries, most of us haven't learned much about her. At best, we were probably told that she was the first witness to the resurrection. Important because she alerted the disciples who said, "Great, we'll take it from here," and went hither, thither, and yon and spread the good news. However, recent scholarship suggests that she was far more important. A woman who was present with the disciples for many of the important events, perhaps even the Last Supper. But as early church fathers, and I'm using that gendered term on purpose, as early church fathers became more protective of the faith in the 3rd and 4th centuries, Mary Magdalene was written out of the Gospels for a variety of reasons. Scholar Elizabeth Schrader-Polzer has done important work in the last 10 years to establish how Mary Magdalene was written out of the Gospel of John. And she proposes, her theory is that this happened so that the Gospel of John would seem less radical. You may have forgotten how radical the Gospel of John is, how different it is from Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And her theory is that people who really liked the Gospel of John wanted it to be included in the Bible. Remember, we didn't have the Bible as we have it now until about the 4th century. So her theory is that to make the Gospel of John seem more like the other Gospels, Mary Magdalene was written out. 4 years ago, in a sermon given by theologian Diana Butler Bass, she talked about this work of Elizabeth Schrader-Polzer's, and that sermon, given at the Wild Goose Festival, is now one of the 3 most watched sermons of all times. Can you imagine? Not 100 views, not 300 views, but millions of views. The only 2 that are more popular than her sermon on Mary Magdalene were Bishop Buddy's sermon at the Interfaith Worship Service after the 2nd inauguration of Donald Trump, and the sermon preached at the wedding of Prince Harry and Mary, wait, what is her name? The Merkel woman. Anyway, that royal wedding. So make of that what you will. 3rd most watched sermon, Mary Magdalene. Most watched sermon, royal wedding, Bishop Buddy's sermon in the middle. And now, going forward, study Bibles will have a footnote that will refer to this work, Restoring Mary Magdalene, Elizabeth Schrader-Polzer's work. This development is a very big deal. I say footnote, you may say, yeah, footnote, yeah. But it takes a lot to be a footnote in the Bible that talks about scholarly work. And this is in study Bibles, not necessarily pew Bibles, but study Bibles. Recognition for this work has come fairly quickly. But we all know that we don't always recognize important people in a timely way. I could give plenty of examples closer to our own time period, but I will choose just one. Summer always puts me in mind of long afternoons in childhood with the luxury of getting lost in a good book. When I was a kid, I was often reading and rereading Madeleine L'Engle. And you probably already know about her book, A Wrinkle in Time. And if you don't know about her book, A Wrinkle in Time, I encourage you to go home and read it this afternoon. It won't take you long, and you'll be glad you did. She wrote a lot of books for children, for adults, and she always said she wrote for readers, not for age groups. And the work that she did combined science and theology. She was a believer. She was an Episcopalian. Her works are fascinating in that way, and they are accepted now, and they've won important awards, but that was not always the case. When she was working on A Wrinkle in Time, she had not been published for 10 years. She got to her 40th birthday. It had been 10 years since she had had anything published. She was beginning to despair that she could really be a writer. Then she wrote A Wrinkle in Time, and then she got at least 30 rejections. Some people say 50. She lost count. So it went to publisher after publisher, still no luck. She was about to decide, I'm just not going to be I guess I can't be a writer. And she was at a dinner party, and she met a different publisher who asked to see the manuscript and decided to publish it. And even then, not everybody loved it right away. For its time, 1963, it's a weird book. It's got a female character in the middle, she's the main character, and it's got a lot of theology, and it's got physics, and it's a fascinating book. The main character, Meg, is spunky and stubborn, and she finds out that her faults, which people have always been nagging her about, are the very things that allow her to save the world. Like I said, go, get this book. We need this book. And I can't say that for most books that were written in 1963. I can't say that for most books at all. When we look at people like Paul or Mary Magdalene or Madeleine L'Engle through God-shaped glasses, we see how successful they were. To keep the garden metaphor going, imagine them as carrying on the work of the Son, the work of Jesus. Jesus gives the disciples and all of us who come afterwards seeds of the good news. And some of us spread them far and wide. I'll refer you back to the parable from last week. We all have lots of different soils that we sow those seeds in. Later believers continue to widen the garden. Some seeds that are sown become wheat right away. They're obvious, like the Apostle Paul and the scholar Elizabeth Schrader-Pulitzer. Other seeds might look like weeds, like Mary Magdalene and Madeleine L'Engle, holding on where they don't appear to be welcome. But time reveals that they too have a place in God's garden. This is the good news. We all have a place in God's garden. Don't listen to the people who treat others like they are weeds. No. Instead, grow in the soil of Jesus' teaching, sure in the promise that we will shine like the sun as we flourish in God's garden, watered by grace, nourished by God's love. Amen.